sorry I couldn't turn up last time. And I gather you had a very, very good time as a result of my absence. So I thought perhaps I ought to be absent this time and enable you to have another good time. Especially as I think probably going to talk rather seriously. It particularly occurred to me that I should because of something in this admirable book of Henry Chancellor's. On the outside, it's called the definitive, if that's the right way to pronounce it, history of Colditz. And I thought, what nonsense. It can't possibly be that it would be that big, or 10 times the size of this. But fortunately, on page 2, or whatever the right page is, I find the author himself saying in direct contradiction of his publishers, there can never be a definitive history of Colditz, or of any place, really, or of any person. And I thought that the particular definitive part of it, which his admirable book lacks a little, though it touches on it, is, I'm sorry to say, the political part, or rather the part about thought, what people were thinking about what was going to happen after the war. And I thought that might be rather serious. And it won't be the whole of what I have to say, but in order to start off with something cheerful, I'll recite to you a funny poem which I wrote immediately after taking the news in the Hyde. You know we had the Hyde. And Jimmy Yule and I used to go up into the Hyde. Henry Chancellor knows this poem. I don't think the rest of you can or do. And we often used to arrive in the Hyde before the actual news, and there was probably something else. And one night we were let in, and Fats Waller, the pianist, jazz pianist, was playing, and he was playing a tune called I'm the World's Most Happy Creature. And I thought, well, I felt in a very, very good mood after that. Perhaps the news was good afterwards. So I came down, and after I'd given the news out to the various dormitories, I wrote a poem which I can remember now, and it's in this book with some not very good poems, but that's a tolerable poem in it, and it says, today there's not a feature that goes against my nature. I'm the world's most happy creature. Don't ask me for the reason for being out of season. Even now, upon occasion, the world's the rhythm section, and I'm the trumpet section. Confusion may come later. Today it's not my nature. I'm the world's most happy creature. And I thought that was rather a nice poem to have written in that awful place, Colditz, detestable place. And I thought it might prepare you for this rather serious part that is coming. I had a reputation, rightly, for being very political. I was a political journalist. And it always troubled me that there were so many reasons why that happened. And it troubled me that that wasn't one of the subjects that seemed to be tremendously occupying prisoners at Colditz or anywhere else, or indeed in the army in general until the end of the war, when it had its effect on the 1945 election. And I was particularly concerned because I had very, very good education, and I came of a fairly well-to-do family, and I went to see, by chance, as a result of a Quaker scheme, helping the unemployed in the Yorkshire collieries. And I was simply appalled by what I saw. This was a determinate influence on me, which has never left me. And I then I was to Germany because I believed that Hitler had solved unemployment. I was then about 22. And there was a lot of propaganda by which half the country probably were taken in to the effect that Hitler had solved unemployment. And I thought, well, if he has, and the class struggle, if that has also been solved in Germany, then it was worth seeing. And Bobo Mitford, Unity Mitford, was a very old friend of mine, as far as I had any very old friends then. And she was in love with Hitler and used to see him. I met him twice through her. He gave me a copy of Mein Kampf and signed it, and I lost it the same day through a hole in my car. And I was taken in for a short time. I also went to Dachau, concentration camp, which had only just been created. And I did my best to persuade myself that things weren't as awful as they really were. So at that time, I was very subject to the influence not of fascism, but of German National Socialism, because of those mistakes that I made, which I shared with a great number of other people. I was disillusioned and put straight about what the real truth was by some brilliant journalists, some of them American, Edgar Allan Mara, William Scherer, the great American journalists of the 30s. And I suppose I lasted in that sort of mood for 6 or 9 months. And then I realized that I was completely wrong. I was very ashamed of it and said so on television a little while ago. Then I went on the Times. And the Times, of course, I say of course, but many of you may not know this, you're too young. But the Times was the paper which was most keen on appeasement, on appeasing Hitler, for which there were very good reasons. And the argument will go on forever, who was right, Chamberlain or Churchill. And I was a kind of protege of Geoffrey Dawson, who was the editor. He was a very charming man, very, very powerful. I suppose at that time, probably the most powerful journalist in the world. England was still a great power. And the Times was often considered to be the organ of the government. And he sent me, often, rather conveniently, my bosses were absent. So I was a junior, but I went to the conferences of the Times. Again, I was about 24, and saw a great deal more of 2 important events, and one of which was appeasement, and the other was the abdication of Edward VIII. And I saw a great deal more than the majority of people my age would have seen at that time. I then had the most wonderful assignment that I've ever had, or ever likely to have. The only really happy assignment I had as a foreign correspondent, that was to cover the tour of the King and Queen in Canada and the United States in 1939. This was the trip on which the Queen, later the Queen Mother, really made her name and swept the whole continent of America. And that was really wonderful to have to report that. And I had one interesting experience of charm, of what's meant by charm. This President Roosevelt, I was presented to President Roosevelt by the then Times correspondent, and he was, who was resident in Washington. And Roosevelt was sitting at an enormous desk, and he held out his hand and said, "Why, Mr. Michael Burn of the London Times." And I was 25, and I thought, how marvelous for you to be able to meet me. I've got here. You needn't stand for president again. This is an overwhelming charm. And I came back, and Dawson was very happy with the whole tour. And he said, this was in, bear in mind the date, July 1939. He said, "We're thinking of sending you to Washington to be our correspondent. And what do you think about it?" And I said, "Well, I'm in the Territorial Army. And what about the war?" And this best informed journalist in the world patted me on the wrist and said, "My dear boy, the danger of war is immeasurably removed." And that had a great influence on me. But this most powerful, supposedly well-informed man, was very well-informed, had gone to this pitch of self-persuasion, as Chamberlain had, as many people had. Very understandably, they didn't want war. So did the assistant editor of the Times, who'd been the whole way through the war, the previous war. So did my father, many other people. It's completely understandable. But I was very shaken by that. And when I was taken prisoner in the raid on Saint-Nazaire, I had the additional shock, of course. Well, first of all, Norway, the fiasco of Norway. I went off with what were then called independent companies. And that was an absolute farce. We spent our time running away and very lucky to get out. And then we trained as commandos. And I was captured in the raid on Saint-Nazaire. And nearly all my greatest friends were killed. And this, of course, was something which has never left me, just as that experience with the unemployed has never left me. And I began to think, what on earth are we going to do after the war, when the war is over? There's never any question whether we would win it or not. I never even thought about whether we might lose it. And what can be done after the war so that there are not things like unemployment, there are not the disgraces there were in the 30s. And so I began to give little talks. The first camp I went to after being captured, one of the first, Spangenberg, there was a lovely man there, General Victor Fortune, who who had commanded the Highland Division, and he had been at Winchester, as my father was, and they were both very good at cricket. And he was commanding the camp, and some of the older prisoners complained of my talks, which a great friend of mine, who was also there, captured and sent us out with me, said were slightly to the left of Major Attlee, which meant mildly Liberal Democrat, I suppose, really. He was, of course, the Labour Prime Minister at that time, splendid man. And they complained, these older prisoners, to General Fortune, and of my talks, and said that I was stopped. So General Fortune was a magnificent-looking man, very respected by the Germans, said to me, I had these complaints, I'd like you to tell me, are you going to say anything against the royal family? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, I'm very glad to hear that, because by them we stand or fall. And he went to the complainants and said, I don't see why I should stop his talks. After all, at school, I took 6 wickets off his father's bowling. And I thought that was very, very civilized indeed. So I went, and then I went gradually further and further to the left, and went on giving these talks, came to Rothenburg, and yeah, this is where I expect your society will be able to help me. Why? Perhaps some of you can tell me why I was sent to Colditz. I've never been quite clear myself. It was either as a possible collaborator with the Germans or as a very dangerous enemy. And if any of you, after all, you are the people who know what happened there much better than any of us who were there. If Michael Booker or somebody can do some researches into the German archives, perhaps one day you can tell me why I was sent there. The possible reasons are, first, that there was a spy, as well known. There was a spy who was in the camp at Rothenburg, where I moved from Spangenberg, who had already given away the wireless set at Spangenberg. And he would have known what I was saying. He'd been in my talks and had told the Germans anything they wanted to know. I denounced him later, the only person I've ever denounced. That's quite a different story. I don't know what happened to him, but Karen Purden would be able to tell you a good deal about him. If there's time, I could tell you later. He would have told the Germans about how I had met Hitler and, and been rather pro-German at that time and been on the Times. But that would have made, and also I was asking for books on German history. The alternative is that rather than being a possible collaborator, I might have been a very dangerous enemy, because at that particular moment when I arrived, I don't know if you couldn't remember, but you may have read about the murder of a lot of Polish officers at Katyn. Their bodies were found in the forest of Katyn, thousands of Polish officers. And the Germans were saying that the Russians had done it. The Russians, the Soviet Union then, had just come into the war. And the Germans were sending around the various prisoners of war camps in order to get people to go to the forest of Katyn to see the evidence that the Russians had done this. The Russians, of course, were saying that the Germans had done it. And 2 very high officers, I think one was American, one British, agreed to go. The records of this are all in the Imperial War Museum and elsewhere. And I protested. This had nothing to do with, nothing essentially to do with my particular political opinions. I thought it outrageous that we should go to investigate a claim of mass murder against a power which at that time was an ally of ours. We now know, of course, the Russians did do it. But I think the Germans might have heard about that from the spy and thought, well, he's a dangerous person. He's subversive, and we must get rid of him. So I was put in secret, solitary confinement at Rothenburg. And I was told that if I would be sent to a camp where I would have a much better time than at the ordinary prisoner of war camps. There would be women and films and hot baths and better food, and I could go for walks and so on. These propaganda camps were quite well known. Rather little has been written about them, I think. And they said, you will go there. They wouldn't tell me why particularly. And I said, no, I won't. And I was absolutely determined that I would not go. I thought, I have Yorkshire blood, and nothing in the world will get me to go to a camp like that. And they came in about every 2 hours, and they said, have you made up your mind? And I said, yes, I won't go. And I thought I'd go to Dachau. And I thought, well, I've been to Dachau already and was taken in by it, and this time I shall go as a prisoner there. And I shall survive. And being very vain, I thought I should not only survive, I should write a book about it. So I was taken away and had a fascinating journey across Germany in the middle of the war, and there suddenly was a glittering castle, looking, as everybody has said, like the castle in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And that was how I came to Kölnitz, and was immediately under the gravest suspicion, of course. It was just a terribly unlikely story. I hadn't escaped, I hadn't taken much interest in escaping. Luckily I was vouched for, first of all by Corin and the people who'd been in the commando with me. And also I found myself allotted not only to this most elite camp, but to the most elite of all the messes, except possibly the one that Michael Alexander was in. It was called the Bullingdon. That was composed of people who remembered me from Oxford, and one who had been at Winchester with me. And there I found myself with my already highly developed left-wing opinions at this mess of about 10 people. Most of them are very strong conservative opinions, very fine people. And this is a point I would like very much to make. I began, as you may have heard, to give talks in Kölnitz about Marxism, very sympathetic to Marxism, and not knowing a great deal, but something about it. And these talks were put up with by the whole camp, except 1 or 2 people I'll come to in a moment, including the whole of this mess. And I thought that was very civilized indeed. In other words, that Kölnitz was a kind of beacon of liberty, of freedom of speech, in the midst of this nightmare by which we were surrounded, where even the mildest liberal opinions were met with imprisonment, and Marxism had been punished with death for quite a long time. And there was this camp listening, this upstart me, this horrible commander, very pleased with himself because he knew that the war was coming to an end, speaking to all these unhappy prisoners who had been captured right at the beginning of the war and seen the Germans at their worst, and telling them that England, Great Britain, must change and has to be changed after the war. Consequently, as Michael Alexander keeps on telling me, I got a reputation of being a communist. We also had a cell. We had a cell. Giles Romilly, who Michael is better than I, who was in my mess, he of course was a journalist, Winston's nephew, a very courageous and fine person, extremely clever. He'd been in the Spanish War, I think. Yes, yes. And sorry? He was. I thought so, yes, I thought he was. It's such a difficult point when somebody is a communist or not. By being a communist, I mean by somebody who is a communist, I mean somebody who is a signed-up member of the Communist Party. I'll tell you about that in a minute, why I was not one. Giles and I were, Henry Chancellor again has got it very correctly in this book, when General Komorowski arrived from Warsaw and gave his talk about the appalling way the Russians had behaved to the Warsaw Rising. He said he would give a talk about it, provided the 2 communists in the camp did not give him away if the Russians happened to liberate Kölnitz, rather the Americans, the 2 communists, being Giles and myself. And we both said, well, of course, it wouldn't have occurred to us. And Henry's put in his book, we were not that kind of communist. The kind of communist I mean is signed up members of the Communist Party who, certainly if they were Europeans, wouldn't have hesitated probably to give their word that they would not denounce General Bolkowski, and then probably would have denounced him. By being a member of the Communist Party, I mean this, that when I was in Vienna, where the Times sent me after the war, I made a great friend deliberately of the Russian TASS correspondents, the journalists there. They all became great friends of mine. No other journalists had bothered with the Russians. The Cold War was just beginning. I arrived about the time that Churchill made his famous speech about the Iron Curtain. I arrived about that time. And I made a dead set with the Times' absolute agreement. I didn't even have to ask their agreement to get to know the Russians and the leader of the Communist Party, the only really brilliant politician in Vienna at that time, called Ernst Fischer. And I made friends of them all. I suspected them of denouncing me as somebody trying to get them on our side. And there was mutual suspicion, but we got on very, very well. Until, even then, we got on quite well. My wife hadn't yet come out to Vienna, I think, but two of them were my particular friends. One of them was the one who described Koelitz after they'd read my book, Yes, Farewell, about it. Described it as sounding rather like a bad hotel, comparing it with what the Russian prisoners were having to put up with. And they said to me, after we talked about the usual non-committal things, which they were very well informed, literature, history, and so on, why don't you become a member of the Communist Party? You would make a very good communist. And I said, well, I'm afraid I don't agree with Marxism. And yes, I'm sure, I said. Anyhow, it's to be in my autobiography, so I wouldn't have put it in my autobiography if it were not true. That I try to think that I am a Christian. And I thought that perhaps I should have said to them, why aren't you Christians? Because I'd seen them at some of the one of the Easter festivals in Vienna, and thought how incredibly devout they were, considering they were very, very top Marxists. Anyhow, they went a bit red in the face, and I said, does that mean our beautiful friendship is now at an end? And they said, no, not at all. We assume that you will go on fighting for peace in your own way, which was the jargon, of course, at the time, to be a fighter for peace. And I suppose I would, but being not quite sure in what my own way would be. And in fact, beautiful friendship did come slowly to an end. They showed much less interest in me. But I continued to be thought of as a communist until the Russians refused me a visa. The Times were, at my own request, going to send me to Moscow. As their correspondent there, they were having trouble with their correspondent there called Ralph Parker. And they wanted me to go, but I was no visa came through. And I persuaded them to send me to Budapest, which was coming in under the communist heel into the communist orbit at that time. And that was a great stroke of luck, because there was still a certain amount of free reporting. And I was able to get around the whole country. And the particular point about whether one was a communist or not was this, that I had to report, it was very painful, the trial of the Cardinal Vincente in Budapest. I happened also to be a Roman Catholic, and my wife was a Roman Catholic. And I had to report this trial of this cardinal. It was most painful, because I could not think of him as a hero. It was impossible. I won't go into details, but the result of my reporting did not make him a hero. The Times had a lot of complaints. They stuck to my reporting because they believed that I was interested in the truth. And there was a debate which was supported to me in Budapest by somebody who certainly was a communist, called D.N. Pritt, who was a very important QC. And he rang me up in Budapest and said, I've been to this meeting at which the communists debated with the Catholics about your reporting of the trial. And the Catholic editor of the tablet said that it's well known the Times correspondent is a communist and has been sacked. And I should tell you that this is slander, and I will act for you if you like. And I thought, that is the last man I should want to act for me. In fact, somebody called Walter Monkton, who was a great friend of my father's, who was a QC, acted for me. And I got damages, which I gave to charity, and I had a very, very nice letter from Michael Derrick, who was the Catholic who had made these outrageous remarks, and that settled that. But it still goes on. People say, Of course, you were the communist, and so on. But that is nothing one can do about it. What else did I do? I wrote these 2 books. This was the one called Yes, Farewell, which the Daily Worker predictably said was the war's greatest novel. And I thought to myself, if that's the war's greatest novel, I shouldn't like to see the worst. It wasn't it was very overwritten. It had certain merits, but it certainly it was very inexperienced. But this was fun. This I didn't mean to write. This was a delirium I had when I was in Colditz. And I was in the sick bay for a while. And suddenly all the things which had been going on in my mind about what was going to happen after the war all came jumbling out, and all these different opinions I had had, and these efforts to arrive at some kind of truth, my own mistakes with the National Socialism, my own conflicts about the Roman Catholic Church, which I need hardly say I no longer belong to, though one could never cease apparently to be a Catholic. I still think of myself, I hope, as a Christian, and my other mistakes about communism as far as they went. They were all came out in this, and also all kinds of other things. My feelings about some of the prisoners, not very friendly, some of them, but I wrote them straight down. And I sent them to my mother in an early stage. She sent them to T.S. Eliot for an opinion. I haven't brought it with me. I had a wonderful letter from my mother I had from T.S. Eliot about them, exquisitely polite. He must have had letters from all kinds of mothers, lovers, sweethearts, whose sons and loved ones were writing poems and asking for his opinion. And he answered them all, but he said that my poem was a little bit monotonous, that he hoped to meet me after the war. And I did actually change some of the, add things on, because it was a bit monotonous. But this, I'll only read 1 or 2 bits. This is a description of what I thought, what my unconscious thought when the castle took to flight. There was a huge storm, and the Coleridge, as you know, was on a rock, and I imagined this storm getting under the roots of the castle, and it took to air. And it says, the castle's crew were such as you will find on any cruise, some proud of being human, some because they could not choose. Some clapped their hands across their brows for fear of loss of face. Some sat quite still and never moved because they knew their place. Some had no shame, some had no hope. Many had lost their head. All this happy family slept in one gigantic bed. The wine and food were very good. The pans were flushed with gin. The birds flew past us ready cooked. We simply pulled them in. Some in their obliging way kept sauce beneath the wing. Some came in whole or in casserole, and one we kept to sing. It sang a song of home sweet home, and on the topmost sea I held my fan before my eyes and wept into my tea. And women past control arose and begged us all to wish. We drained them of their surplus blood and served it with the fish. And it went on like that for about 120 verses. And it was quite extraordinary. And I thought, oh God, I wish this would happen again. Every day I pray for another delirium of that kind. And the story, as Eliot had said in his criticism, it didn't seem to have any particular climax, like The Hunting of the Snark, which is a similar kind of nonsense poem. Not rather better than mine, but similar. And he said there was no narrative, but there is, and I recognized it. It's a story of somebody with a sense of mission. This was me. I had a sense of mission that I had to save the world, and that's why I became all these, attached myself to these different autocracies, ideologies. And I didn't really want one, but each time I started having a good time, which goes on happening in this poem, an awful woman appeared, who was in fact Duty. I knew who she was. She was Duty, stern daughter of the voice of God in William Wordsworth's poem. That's who she was. And she was the person who upset all the prisoners too in Colditz, because they knew a time was coming when they would no longer have everything done for them. They would have to go back to various responsibilities in peacetime. And in a sense, nobody particularly wanted, or some didn't quite want to. There was a kind of feeling, shall we be able to cope with them? And this awful woman, if the prints of the illustrations of this poem, somebody's got, I hope, feel to see if you want. But it's brilliantly illustrated by somebody called Richard MacDonald, who used to do the settings for the film director, Joseph Losey. And they just show this pathetic character, me, who finally she discards. And she dismisses me as being absolutely no good. And she says, and she was there in her druid's chair, one at Eisenford, I knew her jet and Jade Lornette, stern daughter of the voice of God. She said, your mission's cancelled. The ones I represent consider you unsuited to follow up this scent. God, get back into your castle, slink thence to earth, she said, and with a dunce's cap she snuffed the candle of my head. And that's the end of the poem. There she is saying, sending me away with my dunce's cap on. And then the castle sinks. The end of it is, it sinks. There's a verse where I've pushed 12 parsons into the sea, which was showed my dislike of dogmatic religion, rather prejudice, but that's what I think there's a feeling of a great lot of people that there are such things as religions. Christianity, which doesn't absolutely necessarily have to have a profession, but that's a matter of opinion. And there's a passage about a girl whom I was very fond of, who had died on Christmas Eve. Before I went to Colis, and I put her into it, her death made me rather hard and bitter, and made me rather an unpleasant character. And my communism, such as it was, in quotes, more dogmatic and more acid and censorious than it need have been, because I was rather sad. And it says, there was a mortal angel. I did not find her there. I doubted I should ever find her there or anywhere. She knew my boyhood fancies. She shared my childish schemes. A ship in air, a castle, an aeroplane of dreams. And she is gone like quicksilver through a sieve, and slipped among the seraphs who shine but do not live. And then it ends, the castle sinks into the sea. The castle's crew took panic. They tried to sell their souls, all of which was second-hand and full of fearful holes. And everyone was valued by them above its worth. I fetched my wings, I dusted them, I floated down to earth. They crashed in utter silence, got out without a sound, or passed the time with puzzles till all of them were drowned. And this is, to me, the very significant verse which sums up really what my life has been, an endless struggle, like many people's lives, between beliefs. I found a footstep on the beach where none had ever trod. I think that it was left by man. It may have been by God. This was the great conflict I witnessed in Hungary, and it's always a permanent conflict, of course, all over the world. And I witnessed it particularly with a very, very dear friend of ours in Wales, Bertrand Russell, who we saw a great deal of when he went to live in Wales. And I always remember him, supposedly the great atheist of the last century, saying, my only parlor trick is to imitate his voice. It's a very exquisite 18th century Whig voice. And he said, you know, he was about 90, my age, and he said, you know that all my life I've been telling people there is no proof for the existence of God. I should feel great remorse if I have to tell people there was conclusive proof. And I thought that was very endearing, but the sort of thing he should have made up his mind about before. He shouldn't have told people so definitely that there was no proof. That's how that poem ended. And the interesting thing about it is that was the verse that I put in. It didn't actually come out like all the rest. There were other verses I added. I think I've said enough. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. This Robert Baxter, of course, I knew about. I was at New College for an inglorious year, and I didn't go back because I hadn't done enough work. I had 2 scholarships, and I was rather alarmed what would happen if I did go back, because I hadn't done any necessary work. And my father, who was a great sportsman and a bit of a playboy in his youth, but later had a very grand job, he went to see the warden of New College, the Reverend not the Right Honourable H.L. Fisher, to ask what was to be done about me and my scholarships. And this was in 1933, when Hitler had just come to power. And the warden, Dr. Fisher, said, "Where is your son? Where is Michael?" My father said, "I'm never quite sure where he is." He's, of course, I'm afraid he has too much of the party spirit. And I think he's now gone to Germany, probably. And the warden said, "Well, that, I'm afraid, will, if anything, increase his infatuation with politics." And my father went completely blank, because by party spirit he meant swinging from chandeliers. My memory of New College.
You were unhappy that the Russians didn't relieve you?
Oh, yes. There was a great friend of mine, Dusty Miller, was in college. Some of you may remember him. Kenneth, I'm sure remember Dusty. And I taught him economics, as I knew, and he told me a lot about his working class life. And we became great friends, and we decided that we would stay behind if the Americans liberated the castle. We would wait for the Red Army, and we would join the Red Army. Thank God we didn't. We would have been immediately treated as spies, I'm sure. But it was quite interesting, the end, because my book ends with an ecstatic imagining that the Russians had liberated what was then in my book called Durheim. And that was what we imagined happening. And I wrote a play when I was in Vienna, which really was about Colditz. But of course Colditz was completely unknown then. This was in 1947. And it was played by German prisoners. And they played it really rather well. And at that time, again, I had the reputation of being very communist, very left, rather suspect to the Foreign Office, the Times still trusting me, and rightly. And I went on stage at the end of the play, which ended with liberation by the Russians, and with 2 prisoners representing Dusty Miller and myself escaping to join them. And the last line is, it sounds beautiful in German, I was rather impressed with it. And it's said by a cynic who didn't believe in anything at all, just thought it was a waste of time believing in anything. And he says, möglicherweise kommt diese Patience zu Ende und die Welt tritt in eine goldene Zeit ein. Perhaps this patience, he was always paying patience, perhaps one day this patience will come out and the world will enter into a golden age. And that was the curtain. The curtain came down and I advanced, quite a lot of applause from the Viennese audience, not too upset by it being so pro-Russian, and the curtain fell on my head. That was very endearing to a cynical Viennese audience. They thought it obviously been organized by one of the stage hands. And that was, and incidentally, the first mention of Colditz was in the report I sent to the Times immediately after the liberation. Dear Colonel Todd allowed me to go out with Dusty to send a message back, or to meet as soon as possible the nearest American general and tell them about people like Michael and Giles and Charlie Hampton and all the rest of them, and warn exactly what was happening, though of course messages had gone before. And the Times put my message in, and I still have it. So does that answer?
Fully, thank you. Micky, you skipped very lightly over songs there. If I know, it was quite an expensive solo.
Sorry, I'm a bit deaf. Will you,
Yes. Could you elaborate somewhat on your actual first few hours on French soil on the Saint-Nazaire raid when you actually made that lone trip?
Oh, but this?
And even that.
That, yeah. I did nothing.
Having into that while you're only being talked about
This is that
is
should
the
be.
story about Ella Vanham's.
Oh, that's an extraordinary story. That really is extraordinary. I was captured, and I was marched through the streets with Paddy Bush, who was in my troop in the commando, and I saw that we were being photographed, and I thought this is obviously propaganda for Goebbels' one of all his newspapers. So I put up my hands like that in the V sign, and within a very short time, a week or two, I had a message through the Dutch Red Cross. And I thought, how extraordinary, how could anybody know that I'm a prisoner? And I made a lot of it, of course. It was very good morale from the soldiers who were with me. And I really told them that I'd met Hitler. And I said, well, obviously Hitler knows I'm a prisoner. The whole of Europe probably knows I'm a prisoner. And soon I'll be getting pasta from Mussolini. And I don't know what the Pope will be sending. You know, it was that kind of, but it was a joke. And I thought, what on earth has happened? And what has happened was that I had a woman, a friend, called Ella van Hamstra, before the war, a Dutch woman. And she divorced her husband. And she had a daughter who was in England. And Ella was in Holland. And she wrote to me from Holland just before the so-called Phony War started, just before, about Christmas time, 1939, and said, if you're ever near Folkestone, please go and see my daughter, and let me know how she is. And we were. I was in the Queen's Residences at that time. It was before the command in the 60th, Territorial Battalion of the 60th, before the real war started. And I went to see this girl at this village near Folkestone, a rather lanky girl, and just noted her. And then I heard no more from Ella van Hamstra, because she brought the child back to her in Arnhem, where she lived. And then she had, one day, the Germans had occupied Arnhem. She went to the movies. It wasn't a German propaganda film. But whatever the film was, it was preceded by the newsreel of the so-called fiasco at Saint-Nazaire. It was the German propaganda film about our raid. And it showed me like this, and she seized the person next to her and said, it's Mickey, it's me. And it was a German colonel. And she had to kind of laugh that off somehow. And then she and the woman who owned the cinema did something very courageous. The woman who owned the cinema had already had it confiscated. She was Jewish, but she hadn't been deported yet. And she had the keys, or dummy keys still. So Ella and she went into the cinema at night. They went up the projectionist box, and they ran the film through. And there were 4 shots of me. They cut them out, spliced the thing again, the film again, and that was how she knew that I was a prisoner. And that was why she sent me a message. The story doesn't end there. At the end of the war, Holland was in a very, very bad way, probably worse than almost any other country in Europe. And she wrote to me and said that this child of hers was very, very ill, and could I send cigarettes, many cigarettes as possible, to get her penicillin, which had just been discovered. So I sent her hundreds, perhaps more, and she wrote back and said, thank you very much, it saved the child's life. And I didn't see her again, except she came to see a play of mine, not a very good play. It was on in London, the only one in London. And I think she came to see it on the tour in Brighton. And she gave me the enlargements from this, of this film. And I have them still at home, and that's what have been used in various television series. And then I didn't see anything more of her until I got married, till one day I opened, I think it was the Sunday Express, and there was a photograph of her and her daughter, by then called Audrey Hepburn. And I thought, how extraordinary. This really was strange, and I'd saved Audrey Hepburn's life. So I thought, at least I'd done something worthwhile. So that's the story. Well, anything technical would be completely beyond me. But Jimmy and Dick Howe, of course, was usually, or totally with Jimmy and Dick. And what I remember is this incredible efficiency of it all. The drill was, if we were caught, you know that the floor had been scraped very, very thin, and the drill was that if we got a warning, which would be very light, that we would first we'd bang on the floor, make a hole, which I think would go through, I forget into which room, was it your, somebody's room? I think it was somebody's mess room. And we would drop the wireless set through first. Then any escaping equipment there was. And then if there was time, ourselves. That was the drill. And I think there was about twice that we heard the Germans very, very close indeed. It was so efficient, they organized. I remember Lulu Lawton used to come up behind me and Dick or Jimmy and say this was a straw in the attic facing that way, and we by chance moved it that way. He would put it back again in case there was a trick by the Germans. And one really awful thing happened to me. I'm very prone to losing things. I was then and have been ever since school. So being old now, it's nothing to me at all. I lose everything now, but I always have. So it doesn't worry me as much as it worries people who've never lost things. And what happened was, I came down from the attic, and I found when I got to the room where I gave out the news to the heads of the different dormitories, that one of my sheets was missing. And I thought, oh my God. And I thought it's all right, it'll be in the hide, and I'll get it tomorrow next night. But I had some awful qualms about supposing it wasn't, and what I should have done. I told this to Kenneth, and Kenneth told me what I should have done, which I didn't do. The only alternatives which appeared to me were either to forget about it and assume it was going to be all right, and I'd find the sheet in the hide, or to go to Colonel Todd and say, I'm afraid you'll have to open up, or get Dick out to open up the attic again. We'll have to go back and see if I dropped it anywhere. And I thought, that means they'll never trust me again. I shall never be able to do the news. You know, this is a very unsoldierly and on the whole, not a very respectable decision. I decided to let it lie and do nothing. And the next evening, Dick and I went to the attic. The doors were unlocked by Chekhov, or whoever it was, for us. We went in, and there on the stairs was a missing sheet of my notes. And I thought, oh my God, supposing they had gone up, it would have been really awful, because the Germans would have known then that the hide was in the attic. They would have gone on and on and on until they found it. I should have never been able to look anyone in the face again. It would obviously have been thought I was a stooge or a collaborator, and this was my own way of showing them that this lady's already leaving, you see. Disgust. So it was horrible to see. What?
Did you ever see the actual trap actually open? The entrance?
Well, we went into it, yes. We were lowered into it. As far as I remember, it was about half the width of this table, and about, I think, about as long as that. It was about that and half the width of this table, and we were lowered into it. And then Lulu Lotte usually was put this beam in on top, and there we were. And what it looked like from the outside, I have no idea. And of course, all the walls and ceiling were covered with blankets against light shade. It was beautifully done, very, very well. But the technical side I never understood, and it always seemed to work. And we often went up early, because then we would get other news. I spoke a little Russian. We used to get Stalin's orders of the day, which made me even more, quote, communist, of course, about these communist advances. And the Belgians, I remember, I think it was the Belgians who had this savage cry, on les aura, les Boches. We had things like that. And it was very nice that I was trusted with that I could do shorthand. I went in for a very short time with Unity. And she said she was very angry with me for going up and talking to him. We were in a small restaurant, and she always knew where he was going to be, and she said I had promised her that I wouldn't do that. But she had apologized to him afterwards, and he said, oh, I didn't mind at all. him coming up to talk to me. I could tell he wasn't an American. That's all I know about him, about myself. About him, I used to say, when people asked me that question, that he had very hypnotic eyes, which I suppose I was persuading myself of. But I did go to the Parteitag at Nuremberg at the expense of the National Socialist Party and sat very close behind him. And you can't dissociate him from the hysteria of all the Germans all around him. It was impossible to dissociate him from that. Unity used to tell me a lot about him, that he had a sense of humor. I don't remember anything particularly funny that she told me that he had said to her. He was very proud to know her because she was a member of the Englische Hochadel, or the English aristocracy, and he thought that was very important. And he got one thing a bit wrong. He asked her what her name was, and she said Metford. And what is your father's name? And she said Riedesdale. And he tapped on the wrist and said, my poor child. He thought she was illegitimate. She told me that. And I remember telling people, I watched him eating, because we were at a table, very small area, this very special courtyard. And I watched him eating, and I said that he ate like a peasant. But I've never known any peasants, or not then, so I don't really know how peasants eat. This is not a nonsense I used to talk. I had to give some kind of answer. But I'm afraid I can add nothing to what you see on newsreel. Sorry? Was it? Yeah, well, yes. He was fairly small, yes. Yeah, not particularly, rather tubby, slightly tubby. It's impossible to dissociate him from the hysteria and make out why. Sorry? I don't think, there can't be many left, I should think. It was a pity, I suppose, I lost his copy of Mein Kampf. I don't think many, a lot of Germans, of course, would have it. I never read it. But I'm afraid I do remember having one thing, I'm glad I didn't say it. At the Nuremberg Parteitag, there were these colossal demonstrations, and all the, tens of thousands of SS men and SA men and the Arbeitsdienst and so on. And then this avenue, and at a climactic moment, Hitler would walk through these mass tracks to the monument where the eternal flame for the heroes of the National Socialist Party were burning. And I thought and longed to say, this reminds me of the Red Sea parting that the Jews threw. And I thought, if I say that, I should probably not get out of Germany. So I didn't say it.
Micky, who gave the rival speeches, the rival presentations in Colditz against your philosophy?
Charlie Hopton gave one, I think. Do you remember any? Charlie did, yes.
Did Padre Hurd?
Dickie Hurd. Yes, Dickie Hurd certainly would have. And they were very I remember being very ashamed of one thing, I wish I hadn't said. Pierre de Vonnecourt, the French, de Gaullist, wasn't he? He said at the end of one of my talks, I think there were about 3 or 4, he said, and do you think all this could only be done with a dictatorship? And I said, yes, it could only be done with a dictatorship. I thought I wished I hadn't said that. It would have been almost worse if I'd said it could be done by parliamentary means in Britain, which is what Karl Marx is supposed to have written, in fact did write. I don't know which would have been worse. But I wish I had not said that. There's an awful lot I wish I hadn't said. Nothing so far today.